Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today for a Hitchhiker's Guide to Hyperspectral Data. My name's Zach Norman, and I'm a product manager at L3Harris Geospatial Solutions. Hopefully you guys have seen me in one of our ENVI webinars. Today I'm not going to be speaking, but I'm going to be joined by Austin Coates, who's going to be our main presenter today. Austin Coates has been with us a couple of times as far as at the company. He's a great guy and in charge of our technical sales team. He's got a very interesting background in agriculture and remote sensing, and he was kind of the brainchild of our crop science module within ENVI. So you've got a great expert today to talk to you about hyperspectral data. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Everyone on the webinar is muted. You can't talk. So if you have any questions, use the Zoom dialogue. There's two areas where there's you can use the chat, which you can talk to just the panelists or other people. And then there's also an area for questions. This webinar is going to be recorded. And so a recording of that will be posted on our website, hopefully later today or tomorrow. You'll get a link with the recording as well as a PDF of the presentation that Austin's going to be going through today, which you're welcome to share with your friends. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Austin. So take us away.
Thanks a lot, Zach. Hi, everyone. Like Zach said, I'm Austin Coates, and let me start the presentation. All right. Can everyone see the presentation?
Yep.
Sorry, that's kind of
Coming
a silly
through
question.
just fine.
Perfect. All right. So like Zach said, I'm Austin Coates. I work on the sales engineering team. I manage that team, and we are the people that if you were to call and ask a question of your account manager or a specific question that ENVI, can it do X, we would be the ones that would probably answer it. So if you have questions in the future, I look forward to talking with you. So this is a picture of me, my contact information, and yeah. So this is the agenda for today. We're going to talk about data collection, multispectral versus hyperspectral, data processing, as well as real-world examples. Real-world examples will be braided throughout so that you can kind of get a feel for hyperspectral remote sensing and how it's applicable to your problems. I'll actually move the camera over here so you can see me while I look at the presentation. All right. So to begin with, actually, Zach, if you want to launch the poll question, so we have a couple of questions just to kind of set the baseline for who everyone is and kind of our experiences, and that will kind of help drive this presentation a little bit more so that I can talk to the correct level for the entire audience. So first poll question is, what kind of imagery do you use mostly in your day-to-day work? Maybe you're new to it, you don't use any imagery, or maybe you're a hyperspectral expert and that's all that you live in. So yeah, if you could answer this one. All right.
Sharing the results
Nice.
so everybody can take a look.
Perfect. It looks like we have mostly multispectral users, which is great. I'm going to compare and contrast hyperspectral imagery to multispectral imagery throughout the presentation. So you'll get a feel for kind of what are the differences? Why is hyperspectral even exist? And why is it different than multispectral? So that'll be perfect. You want to launch the next one, Zach?
Sure, give me just 1 second. All right, should be coming through.
All right. And then for the majority of our audience, you're using multispectral imagery. Kind of what do you identify as? Are you an analyst? Are you somebody that just receives imagery and then goes in and kind of tags different features in it, or just kind of does literal interpretation? So it's like, oh, this looks like a tree, I'm going to call it a tree. Or are you somebody that does non-literal, something outside of the visual spectrum? So that might be more in the science realm. Are you developing new algorithms? So it looks like scientists. Cool. So we got a lot of multispectral scientists in the audience. That's perfect. this presentation is going to be focused on the science of hyperspectral remote sensing. So I'm glad I hit the target.
And
All
you want
right,
me to
and
have
then
the last one?
Last one would be perfect. All right, and then kind of what industry are you in? This helps me to just kind of know who we're talking to. All right.
And here's the results.
Nice, academic and researchers, cool. So lots of multispectral, science-y researchers. This is gonna be fun. These are my people, so I'm ready for it. All right, let's kind of jump into the meat of this. So hyperspectral remote sensing. We got to start at the beginning. We have to understand kind of where our energy source is and how we're actually collecting that energy, and then how we're displaying it to the computer. So we're going to break this down into 3 parts. So first part, where's the energy coming from? And then it hits the target, gets collected by the spectrometer, and then it gets rendered. So energy source, it is usually emitted by the sun. So you have photons coming from the sun, and then it's going to hit some sort of target. Like Zach alluded to, I really like agriculture, so I'm going to use a lot of vegetation examples, but let's say it hits a plant, and then it does something. So the graph on the right-hand side, this shows the yellow area. This is the amount of energy that is coming from the sun. And then the red area is the amount of energy that's actually hitting the Earth's surface. So in between the sun and the Earth's surface, we have this pesky thing called the atmosphere, and that will scatter a whole bunch of light and absorb and do a whole bunch of crazy things. So later on in the presentation, we're going to talk about how to deal with that, but it's really important that you know that it exists. That if you just get a reading off of the satellite and you take that as it is, you have to know that the atmosphere has played some sort of role in that. On this graph too, you have these little blue numbers, and these show the absorption, kind of atmospheric absorption windows and what is affecting it. So kind of in this window right here, we're going to have water absorbing a lot of light, and because of that, no energy is really hitting the Earth's surface. Same with this portion here, whereas this oxygen one, it's only absorbing a bit, so we still have energy hitting the surface, but oxygen is playing a role in it as well. And then this black line, this is an ideal black body. So I put a light bulb over here on the left-hand side instead of a picture of the sun, because you don't necessarily have to use the sun as your energy source. You could use some sort of artificial light source. And if that's the case, you really need to understand how that light source is emitting its light. So what does its profile look like? And then that will kind of dictate what your end results look like. Because if it's not emitting really high in this visible portion of the spectrum, maybe it's a little bit lower, then that's going to kind of affect the way the photons are hitting the material and reflecting back. So you just have to compensate for that. All right. So second part. So the energy has come from your light source, hit the target, and now it's bounced back and it's going to get to your spectrometer. So here is kind of what happens inside of the spectrometer. You have the scanner, the imaging optics, and then you have some sort of filter in a hyperspectral sensor. That's usually going to be a prism. And that's just going to split the light into a lot of little teeny narrow windows, or we like to call them bands in remote sensing. And those bands will get picked up by a specific sensor. So there will be a filter, so splits the light, a filter will kind of partition it off, and then those pieces of data then will get recorded as one single number. And I'll show you a picture kind of that, give you a little bit better representation of what's going on. But once that light's been split up, it will get picked up by the detector. It will still be in an analog form, so it will just be sort of like an amount of energy, and then the mechanisms inside of the sensor will actually convert that analog signal into a digital signal, and then it will push it out as a digital number. And so that is kind of the rawest form of data that you can get. That's usually like an L1 product, and so that will just be a digital number. It doesn't really have any sort of energy value associated. It's just saying the sensor converted this analog signal into this digital signal, and here's the representation of it. It is a digital number of 1 or 10 or 1,000 or whatever it is. So let's take a look at these filters though. So multispectral versus hyperspectral, kind of what's the difference? Let's compare and contrast. But before we do, I wanna really quickly set the stage and say your overall solution is not hyperspectral remote sensing. And it's not multispectral remote sensing. And it's not this graph on the right-hand side. So this graph on the right-hand side is showing the spectra of a plant. So looking at it, it tells a lot of information about this plant. And so if my question was, what is the protein content or something like that, my answer isn't this spectral profile. It's going to come out to be a number. And so that number, though, is well down the image processing chain. That's my end result. And the image that I have selected is just kind of the first piece of my overall solution. So it's really, really important to understand what you're looking for and then to determine whether or not your imagery provides the pieces of information you need to use to get to that final result. So just saying, oh, I'm going to use hyperspectral data, that's going to solve my problems. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. If I'm just looking for plant versus not plant, multispectral data is perfect. If I'm looking for protein content around 1500 nanometers, this absorption feature right here, excuse me, then that is going to be really, really specific to hyperspectral sensing because maybe my multispectral sensor doesn't hit this absorption feature. So let's take a look at what multispectral sensors and hyperspectral sensors kind of differ in this way. So on the left-hand side, we have Sentinel-2. And so it collects in 13 different bands. And here are the locations of those bands. So along this entire profile, it's going to pick out 13 locations in which it's going to return values. And the width of these bands is it's going to go and say, I'm going to take all of the energy from inside of this area, collapse it down into one number, and then give it back to you. These bands are really, really specifically chosen to kind of dance around those atmospheric absorption features. So that's parts in the atmosphere where the light doesn't hit the surface. And so they have been vetted by the scientific community to say, okay, if we place a band here, then I can do my research because this is going to hit my feature. And if I place a band here, then I can do my research and it's going to hit that feature as well. On the other side of the house, you have something like this sensor. So this is Avris NextGen, and it has 425 bands, and they're about 5 nanometers wide. So they are significantly narrower. So you can see how wide this is, and then how narrow each one of these little teeny slices is. And hyperspectral sensors usually just go wall to wall. They'll go all the way through your spectral profile, and they'll collect at every single point. So because of that, you start to collect all the way through, say, these water absorption features in the atmosphere. And it's really important to know that's happening essentially, because maybe that oxygen or that water in the atmosphere is going to manipulate your signal in somehow. So you have to keep that in the back of your mind and say, oh, okay, I know my spectrometer has collected all the way through, the atmosphere is doing something, so I need to kind of play with that. So let's look at the difference between these two spectra once we collapse it down into those single values. So Sentinel, this was our original, and then we used those 13 bands, and then this is the result. So this is the data that we could play with to go in and say, I'm looking for some sort of material on the ground, and I'm going to use this piece of information to tell me what that material is. Well, it's going to be really hard to really narrow in on, say, our protein content once again, because we just kind of have this little bump out here, and it doesn't tell us a whole lot about it. Whereas on the hyperspectral side, we've got this nice feature. We can tell a lot about what's going on. So this is going to be great. We can see the really, really narrow features. But once again, keep in the back of your mind that you got to know what you want to get out on the end to know what imagery you have to use to get to it. So this, once again, is not the answer. Your answer is just one little piece of it. So just make sure that your imagery collects that one little piece that you know. All right, back to our spectrometer. So what are hyperspectral sensing kind of platforms? What do they look like? You got a couple of different flavors of them. You have a field spectrometer. So this is something that you would actually hold in your hand, and you would walk out in the field and you would point it at a target, and then it would give you some reading back. And it has a lot of bands. I mean, it can have thousands of bands. And so because of that, if we kind of look at this plot over here, the spatial resolution isn't great. So spatial resolution is the amount of area that you could cover essentially with this sensor. And so you're just going to look at one teeny point. And so that's not, I mean, it's very, very high spatial resolution, but it's not giving you a whole lot of data over a larger area. Spectral resolution, you get a ton of bands. temporal resolution, you can go out as often as you want and take a measurement. So I could go out every single day, or I could go out 10 times a day and I could get a lot of information. Drone mounted, you can get really high spatial resolution over a larger area. So that's kind of why I said it's got better spatial resolution, just because you can see lots of features instead of one specific feature. Spectral resolution, it's a little bit lower just because of the payloads on drones can be challenging. So once you start to get out into kind of the longer wavelengths, so if we remember that curve originally, it kind of bumped up and then went down. So these wavelengths over on the far right-hand side, those are longer wavelengths, and those are harder to collect. There's just less energy. If we remember to our initial red and yellow plot, it kind of went up and then it dropped off, and that was the amount of energy that was coming. So if you have less energy, it's harder to pick it up. And so your sensor has to be a lot more sensitive to be able to hit those targets. And drone mounted remote sensing systems have a hard time, because sometimes you have to cool the sensor and sometimes you have to have a little bit bigger sensor. So that can be challenging. So spectral resolution drops off as far as the full profile is concerned, but it can be really, really good in narrow regions. So you can get still hundreds of bands. Temporal, you can fly it anytime you want. Airborne, so once again, airborne can, on the spatial resolution, it's a little bit higher. So maybe you're not getting those really fine details. You're getting a little bit broader pixels. So maybe you're looking at a 5 meter by 5 meter pixel, or 3 meter by 3 meter, or half meter, or whatever it is. It's probably not going to be as high as your drone mounted, just because you're a little bit higher in the atmosphere, but it's still going to be really good. Spectral resolution is going to be a little bit better than your drones, just because you have a much larger platform in which to carry your materials on. And then temporal, you probably aren't going to fly quite as often over each target. And then spaceborne, that is very similar to airborne, other than it's in space. Spatial resolution, you're just a lot farther away. That drops off a little bit. Spectral resolution, that will drop off a little bit too, just because it's hard to put lots and lots of materials into space and have them hang out there forever. And then you also have the atmosphere to deal with. And then temporal resolution, you still have to orbit. So there's kind of challenges there as well. Okay, so you have energy has come from something, hit your target, been picked up by your sensor, and now your sensor has to do something with it. It has to convert it from a digital number into usually surface reflectance. This is once again assuming that you have atmosphere in between your sensor and your target. And so there's a couple of steps along the way. You have to do radiometric calibration, and that will go from digital number to at sensor radiance. And then you have to do atmosphere correction, and that will take you to surface reflectance. So what do those things mean? So radiance. Radiance just takes your digital number and converts it into some measurement of energy. So once again, the digital number doesn't really mean a whole lot to you, because it's just a number of 5. It just says the sensor says that this is 5. And then you will apply usually a gain and an offset to get it into, in our case, watts per meter squared per steradian per micrometer. So that is just a unit of measurement as far as the energy is concerned at that specific wavelength. So you now have radiance, you have some unit of measurement that is equated to an energy, and now you want to go to reflectance. So reflectance is literally what it sounds like. It's the amount of energy that's reflected back. So if we think of the Earth and we think of the sun has hit the Earth and then it's bounced it back, the energy has been reflected off the Earth and back. We know how much energy came in from the sun, and then we can figure out how much energy is being reflected back to the sensor. So we take our radiance here, and then we add it to the amount of energy from the sun. And then we also look at the distance from the sun and the Earth. And then we also look at the elevation. So kind of where is that sun sitting in relation? So very important to remember the difference between these two. And here's a little visual test too, to know if you are in radiance or if you're in surface reflectance. So radiance will usually look, if you plot a bunch of your different spectra all together, it will usually look something like this original curve. So it'll kind of have that sloping down feel to it. Once you convert it to reflectance, then your spectra will be all over town. And that's just because each item absorbs and reflects energy and transmits energy in very different ways. And so that's kind of being represented in this plot. Reflectance is also really important because reflectance gets rid of, or surface reflectance at least, gets rid of the atmosphere. So once you have that value, you now can compare sensor to sensor because you now just have essentially the amount of energy that's being reflected from your target. You can compare different lab spectra to different satellites or airborne sensors or drones. So it's really important that reflectance is used instead of just radiance, because radiance, it has a whole lot of extra noise essentially in the signal that can be hard to compare sensor to sensor, just because you haven't teased out all of the other atmospheric effects and everything else. All right, so we've talked a lot about the atmosphere. How do we get rid of it? So normalization methods versus modeling. So modeling is going to be kind of the most complicated, but the most rigorous. So modeling allows you to turn all the knobs. So essentially, if you have lots and lots of different gases and materials in the atmosphere, you can put those all into a model and say, I have lots of oxygen, and I have lots of water vapor, and I've got some dust, and I've got all sorts of things. And you'll get a model of the atmosphere. And once you have that model of the atmosphere over your target, then you can say, okay, I have my radiance, I have my model of my atmosphere, and now I'm just going to essentially subtract my atmosphere from my radiance, and that will give me my surface reflectance. And so you're taking a guess at what the atmosphere is doing, and you're doing it based off of your knowledge of all the different parameters in the atmosphere. Normalization methods usually use the imagery itself. So you can use a couple of different things. So you could look at one specific area on the ground that's very homogeneous and very similar. And you would say, okay, everything inside of this area should be the exact same. And I'm going to assume that any variations within this area is due to atmospheric effects. And so because of that, I'm going to essentially subtract away any variations so that this little small area is the same, or maybe even my entire image is the same, because I'm going to guess that my atmospheric effects are evenly distributed across the entire image. And so that will give you your ability to essentially use your image to then subtract the atmosphere away without having to know a bunch of information about the atmosphere. There's also another kind of automated sort of modeling, sort of normalization technique that is inside of Envy called Quack. And that will look at spectral profiles of, it usually looks for about 10 different unique spectra in the image. It also looks at a very, very dark portion of the image. And from all of that, then it will try to come up with a gain and offset. And that's what's being represented here. So here's the gain and here's the offset. Here's the equation. You would just take your radiance at each one of these locations, times your gain, plus your offset, and then you would come out with a surface reflectance like this. And so that's an automated process that just tries to go through your image and take a best guess at it. So it performs really well. Maybe not quite as good as the atmospheric modeling, but it's automated and everybody loves automation. So. All right, so now we have our kind of processing workflow in our head. We've gone from some digital numbers and now we're looking to get to some answers. So here's kind of a workflow that we like to follow through. So if we look at pre-processing our data, that's kind of everything that we've gone through up until this point. So kind of covered that part. And then you have spectral libraries. So that's what we're going to talk about next. And then kind of target detection and visualization. We'll get to those in a minute. But, oh, sorry, actually, I reorganized last night, so I forgot where I was going. But spectral indices is where we're going to. So I actually put spectral indices next because it was like, everybody just wants to get to the answer. So let's jump to something that can get you right from pre-processing your data to an answer. So spectral indices are going to kind of be your easiest way to do that. So what a spectral indice is usually it's a unitless measurement, and it's a ratio between two portions of the spectrum. And so once again, we had talked earlier, I really like vegetation. So let's take a look at our vegetation example here. So if we wanted to find out a little bit about this green plot here, this is once again, it's a plant, and this portion of the spectrum, so this really sharp area here is called the red edge. And so this is the portion of the spectrum that is representative of essentially the chlorophyll health or quantity inside of the plant. And so plants really like to absorb a lot of red light, and they like to reflect back a lot of near infrared light. And so the blue line that I have drawn here, that is right along that red absorption feature. And then, hold on, I have to cough. All right, and then the yellow line here, that is a reflectance feature right at the near infrared line. And so if I wanted to use a spectral indice that says how much chlorophyll is inside of this material, I would look at these two different features. I would look at the red absorption and the near infrared because I know plants have chlorophyll and they have this red edge. So I'm going to try to grab either side of that. There's a really well published spectral indice that's called NDVI, and all that it does is it takes the near infrared minus the red over the near infrared plus the red. And so you can see this would come back with some number. So if I had a really big number minus a small number over a big number plus a small number, for a healthy plant, it's going to give me a value of say like 0.5 or 0.7. For something that is not photosynthesizing, it doesn't have chlorophyll in it, maybe this dry sand or something, if we look at this plot right here, these aren't very different from here to here. That's pretty similar. So it's going to give me a really low value. Maybe this dry grass will give me a little bit higher value, but it's nothing like this green grass. And then same with this wet sand, that's pretty flat as well. So we can see that grabbing this portion of the spectrum will help us tell a little bit about this plant. So that's kind of how a spectral indice works. Here's just a pretty graphic. So inside of ENVI, lots and lots of different spectral indices, lots of pre-published information that you can go and grab, and it's everything from like chlorophyll absorption and carotenoids and burn severity, and there's a whole host of these that have been published. And so take a look at those. And the nice part about spectral indices is you can pre-process your data, run a spectral index, and then bam, you're right at your answer. So it's pretty straightforward workflow, and it's nice. So that's kind of one processing step. Once again, multispectral versus hyperspectral. On the multispectral side, did your sensor collect in the window that you need for your specific problem? If it did, perfect. Your multispectral sensor is the one you want to go after. If it didn't, then hyperspectral is going to be your friend because it collects wall to wall and there should be bands right on your feature. And so you can do really, really narrow bands, or you can do wider bands, or whatever you'd like. But once again, you just have to figure out what you're looking for and where that exists within your profile. So once you've identified kind of what you're looking for in your image, so once again, we're looking at some vegetation over here, you can go through and build a library. So maybe I'm looking for a couple of different materials. So if we look at this image over here, I'm going to build a spectral library, and I'm going to say I want an active field, a senescent field, and a fallow field. And so I'm going to grab spectra from all of those different areas within my image, or I could have gone out by hand and collected them all with a spectrometer, so a handheld spectrometer, and I would build up a library. And this library would just have the spectra, and then it would have the name of it. And so that's really great, especially if I'm going to build it from the image that I'm going to classify or do more work on. I would go out, kind of say this pixel is active field, hold on to that information, and then I can go through and kind of feed it back into the software and say, okay, tell me everywhere else that there's active fields. And we go through and tell me everything else. What's also really good is you can resample these libraries. So say I'm in the lab and I have a really green leaf and I take a measurement of it and I do it with my handheld spectrometer, and it comes back and it gives me like a bunch of bands. And I'm like, okay, great. This is what my leaf looks like. And then I'm going to go compare that to a sensor that came off of a drone, and say that sensor only goes from 500 nanometers up to 1500 nanometers or 1000 nanometers, but it's got a bunch of bands in there. Well, if I go from 500 to 1000, I'm only looking at this portion of the spectrum over here. So I need to resample it. I need to essentially cut off everything over here, and then I need to maybe meld some of these together or split them out. So there's a bunch of different techniques to do this. One of the popular ones is spline interpolation. And so that will essentially just draw points and then kind of guess, okay, this is where your band is located. And so you can resample. So if I had this ASD and I'm going to compare it to, once again, on the multispectral side, say I have an overpass from a Sentinel satellite, then I would say, okay, resample this to Sentinel, and then I can compare now. I've got my lab spectra that's been resampled, and I've got my Sentinel, and now I can say, okay, where in my image are these features located? And once again, you could do it with Avarice or something like that. So the resampling is really important because you always want to compare apples to apples. This is also important because once again, if you collect something in the lab and you have no atmosphere associated with it, you've got your own light source, you've done everything, and then you go out and you compare it to something out that's been collected by some other sensor and it's gone through the atmosphere, you need to remove all of those. So we need to do our pre-processing so that once again, we can get apples to apples. All right, selecting Endmember. So if we're looking at an image and we are going to select our locations of interest within that image, we need to understand too that there really is no perfect pure pixel. Every point on the image is going to have lots and lots of stuff mixed together in it. And if we look here, this is a 5 centimeter image. If I was looking at this tree trunk right here, maybe I could grab a couple of spectra along that tree trunk and they might be pure quote unquote, but they would have dry tree trunk and it might have some moss in it or something. So it's still mixed a little bit. But if I get up to 16 meters, I try to grab that tree trunk, I'm starting to get soil and green vegetation and that tree trunk and all sorts of other things. So it's important too to understand what is located within your pixels and kind of understand that there might be lots of mixtures within those pixels that then you have to tease out later. Hyperspectral remote sensing allows you to tease those things out just because you have so much more data to work with. Hyperspectral remote sensing is no different than multispectral in that you can use all the same tools. It's just hyperspectral remote sensing gives you lots and lots and lots more points that you can manipulate and lots more small features that you can zero in on. Just you have more bands so you can do more work with it. So this was a visual representation of selecting an Endmember or some sort of representative feature that I'm looking for. You can also do it kind of in the data space. So this is just 2 different bands. So if I say I had like the red band and the green band, or like 550 nanometers and 1700 nanometers or something, I can look at it and I'm going to look for the most extreme pixels inside of here. So if I were to just grab the 2 most extreme pixels, they would be these 2 most extreme pixels. And you can assume that everything in between is kind of blended together. So this might have a little bit of this class plus a little bit of this class, whereas this one hopefully is just that class. And so this you can take to a much more intense scale, maybe you would say. So if I had 3 bands, I could do it in 3 dimension. And that's kind of where the human mind and visual abilities end, but computers can take it way further. So if I have 400 bands, I can do it in 400 different dimensions. And now I can start to have the computer go in and say, oh, okay, where are these extreme points? And those will come back with representative Endmembers. So the most extreme for your image itself. And you can, once again, take those, put them in a spectral library, and then say, okay, I've got my extreme points. Now go tell me what else in the image looks similar to this. So that's where we're going to get to next. What else looks similar? So target detection and mapping unique materials. So target detection, this is going to be where you say, I have this spectra and I want to go find other things in the image that look like this spectra. And there's a lot of different mechanisms that we can do to kind of get at that. You can also say, I have this list of spectra. Now go tell me where in the image all of these are located and the fractional percentages. So if we look back at the mixed pixels, we can start to say, oh, okay, well, this pixel is 50% this and 25% this and 25% this. And this is kind of a representation here on the bottom of it. All right. So different classification methods that we can use. There are a lot of them. This is where, once again, hyperspectral and multispectral kind of, they don't really differ, but they just, hyperspectral will give you more options because you have more data. So normally, And the without background is kind of the class of classification methods I'm going to talk about first. And that is just looking at, if you had this point cloud here, and this were to represent all of your data, and I said that this pixel, this one right here, this is my pixel of choice. So I want to find everything that looks like this. And then I would simply set some threshold and say, okay, I am comfortable saying if it is this far away, say this one over here, if it's this far away, it's going to be the same class as that one. And that works really great. I can also do it kind of in a statistical way as well. I could kind of bin them up and say probabilities, and it's probably going to fall in this class. But once again, it's just kind of a guess at, here's all my data. How likely are you to fall within this class that I've given you some examples of? You can also do it based off of an angle as well. So not just straight like Euclidean distance, you could also do it. So if this was your origin and you draw a line through this point, and then you drew another line through your next point, and then you kind of looked at the angle between the two of them, you could say, okay, I'm comfortable with this amount of angle, and I'm going to call it the same thing. And so that's the without the background. And that's usually the methods that you use on multispectral, just because you don't have a whole lot of opportunities to really get into those really narrow absorption features. You can't tell a lot about your signal versus your background. You can to a certain extent, and I don't want to scare you away and say, oh, you can't do all these other things, because you may be able to, as long as your features are really well represented. But if they're not, then you really are left just looking at the distance between this one and this one. Now you get into the with background. So this starts to allow you to say, okay, I have essentially two signals here. I have a background clutter signal, so that's kind of like my ground is doing something, and then I have my target sitting on top of it. And is there a way for me to tease both of those out? So I need to take a guess at what the statistics are telling me about my background, and then I can, once again, essentially resample, or in many cases, you reproject your data into a new data space that would say, okay, I'm going to take my target, what I'm looking for, and then I'm going to take a guess at my background, and then I'm going to take a guess at the mixture of background plus target, and then see what is similar to that. So it's essentially the same thing as the multispectral methods, where you're saying, how far is this pixel from this pixel? But now you have reprojected your data into a new data space and hopefully removed kind of the noise or accounted for the noise of the background. And then you're able to start looking at, okay, I'm really close to this one and this one in this new data space where it's taking into account my background. And so that's, if you've ever heard of like spectral match filtering, or ACE, which is the adaptive coherence estimator, that's kind of the way those work, is they start to take in information about your background in order to tease it out. So yeah, once again, hyperspectral remote sensing is no different than multispectral. You just have more data to work with. And because you have more data to work with, you have more options. And because you have more options, the kind of the world is your oyster, and you can look around and say, I'm going to use option 1 plus option 2 plus option 3. Whereas multispectral remote sensing, maybe you just don't have as many options. So it seems simpler because the decision's been made for you. I can only use option 1. With that being said, there's lots of different options, and the math behind the scenes varies in subtle ways, but it has a big effect on your end result. So these are kind of multispectral techniques that you would use, but I like to show them here because they're simple and they're easy to visualize. So this image here, this is a picture of, this is soil. These green bits, those are trees. You got some shadow, and then you also have some wet or some dry soil. So wet soil, dry soil, vegetation, and shadows. So when I fed these into the machine, I gave it the exact same training examples, and then I just varied the algorithm in which I used. And you can see the results vary pretty drastically. So it's a really, I don't want you to necessarily say, oh, like maximum likelihood did better in this case, or spectral angle mapper really got a lot of dry soil. It's more important just to understand that the math behind the scenes plays a big role on the way in which the classification is performed and your end results. And so because of that, don't just go in and think like, if I'm using hyperspectral remote sensing, ACE is going to always work the best, because maybe your scene has a different statistical distribution on the kind of background noise and where everything falls. And ACE wasn't really designed for your specific scene. And so because of that, use something different. Try a different mechanism. There's like in Envy, there's a huge list. So start running through that list. Run a bunch of them. And if you know kind of, if you have a test area and you're like, oh, I'm looking for this tarp, and this method did really well over my scene in this area, and it found the tarp really well, whereas this one didn't. Perfect. Use that method and then apply it to another scene that looks really similar. So I just want to kind of drive home the fact that you want to test things out. Don't just assume like, I read one paper and they said it worked. Like, test a couple out. Like, computer time is cheap. So use it to its fullest. So that's kind of looking for, I have my target spectra and I'm going to look in the image and see if I can find my target spectra. And once again, you have a kind of a level of variability that you're very comfortable with. You would say, if the spectra in the image differs from my sample this much, I'm just going to call it the same thing. In spectral unmixing, you can now start to say, I have a whole list of spectra, and now tell me what percentages of that list of spectra fall in each one of these pixels. And there's different methods. Some methods will require you to know all of the spectra in your image. So in this scene, I would have 4 different spectra that I would pass in, and it would come back and it would say, okay, here's the fractional percentage of each one. And then some of the other methods don't require you to know all the spectra. It would just take a guess. It would say like, some of it's unclassified, or oh, this is how much is in each one of these pixels. But if we look here, here's a nice little visual representation of soil, green vegetation, and dry vegetation. So if this was just one solid pixel, I had 50% soil, or 25 and 25, and I add them all together, I would get this red line here back. And so that's my mixed pixel. And it's built up of this soil spectra, as well as this green vegetation spectra, as well as this dry vegetation spectra. And luckily, through the magic of math, it can come back and say 25%, 25%, and 50%. So it's a good tool to have in your back pocket, especially if you're working with a sensor that has a little bit lower spatial resolution, so a little bit bigger pixels, but still has a lot of spectral resolution, so a lot of bands. Then you can start to unmix those pixels. And I wanted to also touch on dimensionality reduction. So we've talked a lot about matching one pixel to another pixel, and we've talked about resampling. So if you did something in the lab and then you went out to the field and tried to test it, those are 2 very different environments, and the atmosphere once again plays a big role. So I have these 2 atmospheric absorption features here labeled, and I have removed those because I know that in those features, energy is not hitting the Earth's surface. And so it's going to bounce all around and it's going to give me a really weird shape in those areas. Whereas when I was in the lab, it gave me a really nice shape in those areas. So if I try to compare my lab spectra to my like in situ measurement or whatever scene derived, those features are going to be very different. And then when I push those into my algorithms to go and find the spectra, it's going to say, well, this doesn't look right. These are way different. And so because of that, I can't match this. So it's really important to start to remove portions of your spectra that you know are not helpful for the algorithm to find your target of choice. So that might be the absorption features here, or that might be confusers. Maybe you have something that reflects well in some area, and then when blended together, it makes it look like a totally different spectra. And because of that, it's throwing off your algorithm. So kind of once again, you need to make sure that you can look at what you want, look at your input spectra and identify the features that are important to you, and then make sure your sensor collects those features, and then make sure that there's nothing else that kind of can confuse it. So once again, hyperspectral remote sensing just gives you a lot more data to play with, And because of that, you have to be a lot more careful with interpreting your data. So you can't just go in and say, oh, I've only got 4 data points, so I'm going to use them all, and that looks great. So a multispectral sensor that's red, green, blue, near infrared, I'm going to use it all. Because hyperspectral sensors may have things that can confuse the algorithms and things that are absorbing in the atmosphere and lots of different things. So just make sure you really understand what you want to get out on the end and then what you're going to use to essentially get to your end result. Last but not least, visualization. So there is no perfect way to visualize hyperspectral remote sense data. It is really hard to look at because there are so many different bands. The human eye really likes red, green, and blue. That is what we are designed to kind of look in. And so if we go out in the built environment or the outside, we're going to look at red, green, and blue light. We're just going to look at those 3 bands essentially. Hyperspectral remote sensing will give you all of those bands. So now you have to start plugging them into essentially your red, green, and blue color guns and building new imagery. And so you start to, like, maybe I'm going to look in the really long wave portion of the spectrum, and I'm going to kind of push that into my visual cortex, and I'm going to start to say, okay, these bands tell me something, but still I can only visualize essentially 3 bands at once. So that's why hyperspectral remote sensing, you do a lot of data processing without visualization. So you will run a lot of math on your image, and then the result, you will then visualize it because it's usually a single number or a classification map or something like that. And so you can understand that. If you just try to visualize the raw data, it gets really messy just because there are so many bands and you don't know which band to choose, or you can only choose a couple at the same time. So in the visualization portion, it takes a bit of time to flip through and understand, okay, I want to look at this and this and this. There's different ways to kind of compress all of your data together so that you can see more data at the same time. And those kind of, they kind of straddle that data reduction. So the dimensionality reduction realm, and these things are like principal components analysis. If you've ever heard of that, that will take all of your data and then look for essentially like, what is the most interesting vector? So what's the vector that's showing me the most interesting and most data essentially within my cube? And then it will go to one orthogonal to that and say, okay, where's the second most and the third most and the fourth most? And it does this, and then it comes back so that the first couple of bands in your new processed data essentially will give you essentially 90% or very high 90s worth of the data in your entire cube. So sorry, I kind of garbled that, but essentially PCA is a data reduction method that will allow you to visualize all of your hyperspectral data in only a couple of bands. Kind of gets a little funky, but it works. So yeah. All right, I think I got about 10 minutes left for questions. I talked a little faster than I anticipated, but has there been anything that came up in the chat, Zach or JP, that people are asking about? Is there anything that you want me to cover that I didn't touch on? Please.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've got a few things for you, Austin.
Perfect.
Some of them are short and sweet, and others I think I think it'd be good to spend a little bit more time on.
Perfect.
So first and foremost, I saw this a few times in the questions. Can you talk about, or if there are any publicly available, spectral libraries for people that might not be familiar or using open source tools? Is that something that they need to pay for, or can you get some of those for free?
You can totally get some of those for free. So if you listened to our talk last week, Prasad Tinkerbell talked about one of his spectral libraries. It looks at the globe and it looks at a lot of different vegetation types. And I used the one from North America the other day. You can download it from the NASA site. I think it's NASA site, or no, it's USDA site, sorry. And it has like 4,000 different spectra in it. We also, with Envy, if you use our software, comes with NASA JPL, as well as USGS, as well as an Aster library. And yeah, there's a bunch of libraries that are already preloaded in there that you can use. Yeah, they're around. You just have to search for them.
Cool. So the other, and I think a little bit more involved question here, could you pop back to your slide where you had some of the different results from classification algorithms?
Yes. This guy?
Yes, perfect. So I'm going to get a little picky about a word that you used here. When you were talking about these algorithms, you said the word training data. And just to make it very clear, these algorithms don't use machine learning, correct?
This is very correct, yes. So they Zach does a lot of deep learning. I don't do a ton of deep learning. Zach is picky about his wording. I totally get it because training data is been usurped by the deep learning community. So yes, these do not use deep learning at all. The data in which you pass in is just representative of the spectra in which you want to find. So they are regions of interest that you are interested in. They are just bundles of spectra that you say, go find things that look like this. And then the math tries to match up the spectra in your image to the spectra that you passed in. So there's nothing that's trained, there's nothing that's learned. It's all just one step to another, just straight math.
Yeah, and maybe just to elaborate on something you just said. So what you're typically comparing here is going to be spectra, either coming from spectral libraries or your data set that you have open and you're looking at. So you could draw regions of interest to, say find water or grassland and extract those pixel values and basically map where those are in your scene. And one of the great things about these type of algorithms compared to deep learning is you don't need training data. You just give it what you're looking for and it will give you a result. And I think that's just an important concept for people to understand, is that these algorithms, and sure, there are some algorithms that look at your spectra that are machine learning or deep learning, but that's one of the things that's really fun or different about a lot of spectral analysis is stuff's, it's pretty easy. If you know what you're looking for, it's very easy to run them. I think you said they're cheap CPU or cheap, low cost to get some of these answers.
Yes.
So that, it's traditional kind of science-based algorithms that have, math and papers and stuff behind them.
Very much so.
So let's see here. So one of the things I think would be important to call out a little bit, if you, and this is a little bit of an opinion question, what would you say that the biggest difference apart from number of bands is between multispectral and hyperspectral data?
The biggest difference, I would say, would be I don't know how to word this, kind of like the level of understanding you have to have for your data. Because you have more bands in hyperspectral, you have more choices you get to make, which just requires you to understand what is really happening with that data. So I talked a lot about the atmosphere. If you're looking at features that are really close to those atmospheric absorption windows, then they might be manipulated in some way. And so you have to understand really what's happening inside of it, whereas a multispectral sensor is usually tuned to skip those features. So if you use Sentinel, they have said, I'm not going to collect in here, so I'm not going to use it at all. Or this one has a lot of water vapor in it, so I'm not going to use that one either, because they only have so many bands that they can work with, and they've chosen them very specifically. Whereas hyperspectral gives you everything, so you have to, as the user, be able to understand what is happening at each point and really get into the data and say, I'm going to use this instead of this, or I'm going to use this, but I know it's been manipulated in this way. And so that's, yeah.
So maybe a way to rephrase one of the things that you said, which I think is an important detail, is there's some bands with hyperspectral algorithms that, because the atmosphere or other things in the air absorb a lot of the energy from the sun, there's not much for the sensor to collect. So some of your bands could be bad or very noisy because there's not much information that they can be capturing.
Yep. Yeah. But it's not, it's not only those bands and kind of the atmosphere. Like there can be other things that are manipulating your spectra. You just have to understand what those could be. So it could be background, it could be a whole host of things. So yeah, you just have to understand that you have to know a lot more about your scene, just because the potential for false positives are a lot higher.
All right, and I see we have had many questions that have come up in the last couple of minutes here. I know we've answered about 28, if you guys can see in the little Q&A panel. So we've gone through quite a few while you've been presenting, Austin.
Perfect.
And since we're about at the top of the hour, I think we'll probably call it here, unless there's anything that you see that or you think would be important to make sure to cover before we stop.
No, I think just kind of my final like takeaways would be hyperspectral is not scary, and it's also not always the answer. The answer is whatever you need to solve your problem. So it's important that you frame your question at the beginning and then look for the data source that can answer your question. Don't just always assume hyperspectral is the best and it is the answer, because it's not always. Sometimes multispectral is, or sometimes panchromatic is. Whatever your question is, choose the data source that is most applicable for that. And then secondly, whatever data source you choose, make sure you understand that it essentially is a chain all the way through. So step 1 will affect the results at the end. Step 2 will affect the results at the end. So you build off of every piece all the way through it. So don't just grab an image or something and then start at this step over here and assume that all of this was done correctly, or assume that it was all done the way you want it to have been done. Make sure that you look at each piece along the way. We get questions all the time like, hey, why can't I do this with this data? And it's like, oh, it's because that data is in Radiance instead of Reflectance. So the person had grabbed this piece of data, they thought they could just do these steps afterwards, when in reality there was one step before that they actually had to do. So just make sure you start at the beginning and understand your data all the way up through, so that you can get the answers that you want at the end.
Cool, thanks. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and wrap things up. We appreciate everybody's time and attention today, and thank you again, Austin, for speaking to us and teaching us a little bit about hyperspectral data. Just as a reminder, a copy of the slides will be sent out to you, and a recording of this webinar will be made available in just the next couple of days. It'll also be posted up on our website at www.L3harrisgeospatial.com. So yeah, with that, thanks for joining us, everybody, and hope you have a great rest of your day.